Marcus Crassus became the richest man in Rome by turning other people's disasters into opportunities. He did not need to start the fires. When buildings burned, frightened owners often sold cheaply. Crassus bought damaged homes, nearby property, and kept hundreds of skilled builders ready to rebuild. But that ruthless strategy was only the beginning of a fortune powerful enough to shape Rome. In the 1st century BC, Rome was rich, crowded, and dangerously easy to burn. Many people lived in tightly packed buildings where fire and structural collapse were constant threats. Then when a building caught fire, the owner could watch years of wealth disappear within hours. Crassus understood something simple. Panic makes people accept prices they would normally refuse. According to the ancient writer Plutarch, Crassus bought houses that were already on fire, along with neighboring properties whose owners feared the flames would reach them next. He could do this because he controlled something almost as valuable as the land itself: a workforce of more than 500 enslaved architects and builders trained to repair damaged property. Once the danger passed, those workers could restore what Crassus had purchased for a fraction. And the property could become valuable again, while the frightened seller walked away with almost nothing. Plutarch later wrote that public disasters became one of Crassus's greatest sources of revenue. It sounds like the behavior of a man who had never known what loss felt like. But Crassus understood loss very well, because his own family had been nearly destroyed by Roman politics. He was born into a wealthy and respected family, with a father who had held high office. Yet Rome in Crassus's youth was being torn apart by civil war and political revenge. When the faction of Marius and Cinna seized control, Crassus's father and brother were killed. And the young Crassus fled idly before the same political violence could reach him. He escaped to Spain with a small group of companions and hid near the coast, spending months in a cave while allies quietly brought food to keep him alive. That experience mattered because Rome had taught him a brutal lesson very early. Property, status, and even family could disappear the moment the wrong faction took power. Crassus survived, and when the political tide changed, he returned on the winning side. He joined Lucius Cornelius Sulla, the general who eventually captured Rome and crushed his enemies. Sulla's victory brought something even darker than battlefield violence: the proscriptions. Lists of condemned men were published, their lives were forfeit, and their property was confiscated. Estates that had belonged to powerful families could suddenly be purchased at enormous discounts. And Crassus was one of the men willing to buy while others were being destroyed. Plutarch says he was never tired of purchasing property from these political confiscations. So before Crassus became famous for buying around fires, he had already learned another method. When Rome created losers, the fastest path to wealth was often buying what they could no longer keep. His fortune grew through property, mines, farmland, enslaved labor, and carefully chosen financial relationships. But Crassus was not simply a man who collected money and disappeared behind a palace wall. He understood that in Rome, wealth became truly powerful only when other people needed it. He lent money, supported political candidates, represented people in court, and made himself constantly available. Unlike aristocrats who protected their status by keeping their distance, Crassus cultivated obligation. A loan could create gratitude, a legal favor could create loyalty, and loyalty could create votes. His house was open to visitors, and he built a reputation for remembering names and helping petitioners. Even his generosity had an edge, because a favor from Crassus was rarely forgotten by either side. His fortune was becoming more than private wealth. It was turning into a political network. One man who benefited from that network was a deeply indebted politician named Julius Caesar. Before Caesar left for Spain, creditors were pressing him hard enough to threaten his departure. And Crassus helped guarantee a huge portion of the money Caesar needed to move forward. That relationship would become part of something much larger than a private financial favor. By the late Roman Republic, 3 men stood above almost everyone else in influence: Julius Caesar, Pompey the Great, and Marcus Licinius Crassus, the richest of the 3. Historians later called their political partnership the First Triumvirate, though Romans did not use that name then. Count Caesar had ambition and growing military success, while Pompey had already built a legendary military reputation. Crassus had money, connections, and enormous political influence, but one thing still bothered him. He was powerful, yet he did not feel admired in the same way as his rivals. Pompey had victories across the Mediterranean and the nickname Magnus, meaning the Great. Caesar was beginning to win spectacular campaigns in Gaul, sending stories of conquest back to Rome. Crassus had wealth almost nobody could match, but wealth was not the same as glory. He had already commanded armies before, and his most important victory came against Spartacus. The slave revolt had humiliated Rome as Spartacus defeated force after force sent against him, until the Senate finally gave Crassus the command and expected him to end the crisis. Crassus restored discipline with terrifying severity, then pursued Spartacus across southern Italy. He trapped much of the rebel force behind a massive ditch and wall across the peninsula. And eventually his army defeated Spartacus in a final battle before Pompey returned from Spain. But even this victory did not give Crassus the reputation he wanted. Pompey arrived near the end, destroyed escaping rebels, and claimed his own share of the credit. To Crassus, that must have felt painfully familiar. He had the achievement, but someone else had the legend. Years later, when political deals gave him control of Syria, he saw another chance. To the east stood the Parthian Empire, wealthy, powerful, and famous for its cavalry. Rome was not facing an emergency there, and many Romans opposed an unnecessary war. Crassus went anyway, because Parthia offered something no business deal in Rome could provide. A major eastern conquest could finally place him beside Pompey and Caesar as a celebrated commander. And at this point, the story of Crassus changes from aggressive calculation to dangerous overconfidence. The man who had spent decades finding bargains was about to make the worst investment of his life. In 53 BC, Crassus led a Roman army across the Euphrates and into Parthian territory. His forces were experienced, but they were built around heavy infantry and close formation fighting. The Parthians planned to deny him exactly the kind of battle Roman legions preferred. Near Carrhae, a commander named Sulla met Crassus with mounted archers and heavily armored cavalry. The Parthian horse archers could approach, fire, withdraw, and continue attacking without staying within reach. At first, the Romans expected the storm of arrows to stop when ammunition ran low. But the Parthians had prepared a supply system that kept fresh arrows moving toward the battlefield. Roman formations stood under repeated attack while their enemy remained frustratingly difficult to catch. Crassus then sent cavalry forward under the command of his son, Publius. Publius was young, experienced, and had served with Caesar in Gaul before joining his father. The Parthians drew his force away, surrounded it, and destroyed most of the men with him. Publius was wounded and, according to Plutarch, ordered a companion to end his life. The Parthians cut off his head and carried it back toward the Roman army. Crassus now had to command thousands of frightened soldiers while confronting his son's death. He tried to keep the army together, but the battle had already turned into catastrophe. After nightfall, surviving Romans withdrew toward Carrhae, leaving many wounded men behind. What had begun as Crassus's search for glory was becoming one of Rome's most humiliating defeats. The retreat soon became confused, and negotiations with the Parthians followed. Ancient accounts disagree about exactly how the final confrontation happened. But during a tense meeting, violence broke out, and Marcus Licinius Crassus was killed. The man who had survived Roman civil wars defeated Spartacus and built an extraordinary fortune. Died far from Rome in a campaign many of his own countrymen had never wanted. Then came the detail that made his death almost too perfect for later storytellers. Some ancient traditions claimed the Parthians poured molten gold into Crassus's mouth after his death. We cannot treat that as a confirmed fact. The surviving accounts are late and dramatic. But the legend survived because Romans believed it matched the man they thought they knew. Crassus had spent his life associated with money, property, bargains, and relentless accumulation. So later generations imagined that even his corpse was punished with the symbol of his greed. The irony is that Crassus was more complicated than the caricature history remembers. He could be disciplined, hardworking, politically skilled, generous to guests, and fiercely prepared in public life. He was not a fool who accidentally became rich. He understood people and institutions extremely well. That may be exactly why his ending feels so striking. The instincts that made him successful in Rome did not guarantee success on a foreign battlefield. In business and politics, he could wait for fear, weakness, or desperation to create an opportunity. At Carrhae, he was the one who entered unfamiliar ground, while his enemy controlled the conditions. For decades, Crassus had profited when other people were forced into bad decisions. In Parthia, he became the man trapped inside a bad decision. His fortune could purchase land, labor, influence, political alliances, and access to Rome's most powerful men. It could help Caesar escape his creditors and help Crassus stand beside the Republic's biggest names. But money could not give him the reputation he wanted most. So he went looking for glory beyond Rome and lost the army meant to deliver it. Crassus spent much of his life turning disaster into profit. Yet the final disaster was the one opportunity he could not buy his way out of. And that is why his story still feels surprisingly modern after more than 2,000 years. Wealth gave Crassus options, influence, and power, but it also convinced him that one prize remained. He already had more money than almost any Roman could imagine. What he wanted was immortality. Instead, history remembered the fortune, the burning properties, the failed invasion, and the legend of gold. If you want more true stories about money, power, ambition, and the darker side of history, subscribe to Timeless Histories, because the past becomes far more interesting when we follow what people wanted.